Listen closely. Two cries are about to split the night, and only one will be allowed to live in the light. Welcome, traveler of secrets and forgotten destinies. You have arrived at the threshold of a story whispered by monsoon winds and kept quiet by velvet-draped corridors. If this tale finds a home in your chest, breathe with it, stay with it, and let your heart become our lantern. And if you wish to walk further with us into palaces and alleyways, into names erased and lives rewritten, support this journey. Subscribe, share the whisper, and leave your mark, your thoughts, your doubts, your anger, so that the river remembers you too. The monsoon. The monsoon had come early to Varanasi, as if the sky itself wished to dress the city in heavy silks of rain. The palace rose from the riverbank with an authority that had very little to do with law and everything to do with memory. Sandstone walls the color of ancient honey, latticed windows like the eyes of watchful gods. Lanterns swung in the damp breath of the storm, and a ceremonial peacock, confused by thunder, paced the veranda with the vanity of a courtier. Somewhere behind those tall shutters, a queen labored, her fingernails crescenting lines into the bed's teak frame, her breath carrying the cinnamon bite of clove water and the puja smoke of marigold and ghee. The room smelled of thunder and milk and fear. Two midwives tended her. The elder Kamala had hands that had caught more infants than a census officer could count, and had watched more women cross the threshold between life and whatever came after, with the patience of a river stone. The younger, Meera, still wore her hair like a promise, and her bangles like commas in a sentence she had not yet learned to end. At the foot of the bed stood a priest of impeccable lineage. His sacred thread was so fresh it might have been woven from yesterday's pride. He murmured verses into the storm, every syllable carefully arranged to resemble order in a room where flesh had declared chaos. "Steady," Kamala whispered, pressing oil into the Queen's taut belly as another contraction pulled a bright line across the air. "It won't be long now, Your Highness." It was the sort of lie that midwives tell in kindness, a gentle theft of minutes from pain. When the first infant crowned, it arrived with the solemnity of a small moon. The cry, at first surprised and thin, deepened, then flooded the room with a violin's insistence. Kamala wrapped the baby in a cloth that the palace astrologer had blessed at sunset, blue as the memory of an ocean the child had not yet seen. The priest inspected, nodded, and blessed the boy with a pinch of ash that left a grey comet on his gold-brown forehead. The queen wept as if she had been returned to herself after being lost. "Another," Kamala said, her voice flat with awe. "Not every womb is a house with two doors, but when it is, a second destiny pushes forward." The second child struggled, then came in a rush, startling even the storm. He emerged quieter, as if reluctant to take up space already occupied. For a moment he did not cry, and the room held its breath like a necklace too tight on a throat. Then he exhaled a wet sigh, and a soft cry lifted, fragile as the skin of milk over tea. Two sons, two cries, two lanterns hung on the same nail. The priest's pupils narrowed. Twins. Omens travel well in pairs, he thought, but he said aloud only the polite thing. The gods are generous. He was a man trained to hear the subtler music of hierarchy, and now he heard it. The thread between destiny and purity, a line that could tangle if pulled by the wrong hands. The palace needed one heir, not two mirrors inviting inconvenient questions. A lineage must look forward like an arrow, not ripple backward like a pond. Kamala held the second child, searching his face for complications, for the tiny irregularities that become stories larger than a life. She found none. He was the image of his brother, two drops of the same monsoon. The queen reached for both, eyes glittering with exhausted delight. In that reaching, a gentle irony. How easily love makes room, even in palaces that cannot. Outside, thunder applauded a secret meeting. The palace steward entered on soft sandals, bowing until his spine resembled a question mark. He brought with him a bundle of silk, too richly dyed for a servant to touch without permission, and behind his eyes, a message had already been written. One twin is a symptom, the other a solution. The astrologer requests a private council, he said, his tone engineered to sound accidental. The queen, heavy with relief and milk, nodded. Kamala laid the infants in a low, warm basket lined with cotton and ashes of incense, the smell both sacred and domestic. The priest and the steward conferred near the window, their voices softened by rain. Mira, trying not to listen and failing beautifully, cradled the basket closer. In the lattice of thunder, she imagined she heard a vow. "I will remember both names, even if I am told there is only one." "Your Highness," the priest said at last, turning to the queen with the calm of a man who has practiced bad news in front of a mirror, "we must consider what the heavens intended. Twins can divide a throne. Already the chart spoke of a shadow that would follow your house if indecision were allowed to rule. Better one sun than two rival dawns." He glanced at the steward, whose silence had the oily shimmer of transactions. "We will make the necessary arrangements, a ritual of cleansing, a declaration of a stillborn to appease forces that dislike duplicates." The queen's mouth opened, then closed. She had been trained to carry the weight of custom with a dancer's poise. But custom has sharp edges. "They are both breathing," she said, her voice baffled by the arithmetic of cruelty. "They are both mine." In that moment, the second irony of the night made itself useful. In palaces, motherhood is negotiable, lineage is not. The steward's bow deepened. "Forgive me, Your Highness. The palace will protect your honor." He said honor but meant reputation, and he meant it in the ledger sense. Outside the temple district, even clay cups carry a caste in their dust. In here, the birthing bed carried a dynasty on its sheets. There are customs the city speaks aloud, and customs the city hums under its breath. Among the latter, a practice as old as fear. When a second mouth promised to complicate inheritance, a wet nurse was arranged, a ledger adjusted, a prayer recited a tone lower than truth. If a baby vanished into the tunnels of rain and rumor, it was because the gods had their reasons. So convenient, these gods, so helpful at court. Kamala's eyes found Mira's. The elder woman knew the maps of the city, shadows better than any census, and had walked every alley where stillborn meant stolen. She cradled the second infant, whose eyelids fluttered like moths at a lamp. He smelled of salt and iron and a sweetness barely begun. The elder midwife's third irony for the night. She had learned to wield obedience as a shield, but tonight, obedience felt like a blade pointed the wrong way. They performed a ritual of sorts, brief as a swallowed cry. The priest offered a blessing that resembled a verdict. The steward produced a second bundle, the silk heavier, the dye darker, as if color could function as alibi. Mira, hands shaking, took the firstborn to the queen's breast. Kamala stepped toward the veranda, where the rain wrote its endless scripture on stone, the second child warm against her collarbone. The city's belly was awake despite the hour. Rainwater braided the alleys, and clay lamps guttered beneath awnings patched with jute and hope. Kamala walked as if she had been cut out of her own shadow. She could still hear the first cry from the room behind her, the safe cry, the recorded cry. In her arms, the second child slept with the stubbornness of innocence. At the end of the servants' corridor, a figure waited, a man with a scar along his jaw like handwriting, eyes careful not to rise above a Brahmin's waist. He was a messenger for the palace's other needs, the ones not listed in the budget. Beside him stood a woman, sari clean but thin, hands dusted with flour, the familiar poverty that smells of cumin and river mud. "This is the one that did not survive," the steward's man said, arriving with a declaration rather than a question. The woman lifted her arms. Kamala did not move. Inside her, a drumbeat grew. Two cries, two cries, two. The woman's eyes flickered. A moment of understanding passed between them like contraband. The child shifted, opening his mouth as if to speak, and instead offered a sigh so complete it seemed to contain the city's exhaustion. Kamala wrapped the boy tighter and pressed him into the woman's embrace. "He survived," she said, the words falling like stones into a well. "But the palace will not remember it." The messenger frowned, then shrugged with the weary pragmatism of men who orbit power, but never touch it. He handed over a coin purse. It clinked in the rain with the cheerfulness of betrayal. They left the palace road and entered lanes where names were thinner than hunger. Here the city kept its promises with a broom and a bucket. The woman's home was a low rectangle of mud brick, its doorway braided with marigold stems gone brittle. Inside, a small shrine held a chipped clay image of a goddess whose smile had been worn away by fingers asking forgiveness. A boy slept on a rush mat, one arm over his head in the universal grammar of trust. The woman laid the infant in a woven cradle that had waited too long for a wait. He woke. He cried. The room warmed as if the sound were a lamp. The boy on the mat stirred and smiled without waking, as if his dream had just received a guest. The woman's husband entered, dripping, a broom slung over his shoulder, the emblem of a labor the city pretended not to see. He stopped, astonished. Whose child? Ours, the woman said with the bravery of someone who knows a fact is sometimes an invention that refuses to apologize. The gods remembered us. They named him Arav because the word means peaceful and because hope deserves irony's gentlest form. He quieted, turned his face toward a breast that had known sorrow enough to produce milk on command, and latched with a sigh. There are treaties older than kingdoms, the pact between hunger and hands. Back at the palace, the firstborn lay against his mother's skin, her heartbeat counting the seconds of a life designed to be measured by drums and conchis. They named him Arush, first ray of the sun, because winners often get to keep the dawn. The priest intoned verses of protection for a lineage with one heir, and the steward's ledger closed like a coffin with excellent hinges. In the palace register, a line was written in elegant script, second child stillborn, ritual performed. The ink dried into a history so believable, no one would ever have to believe it. Outside, the monsoon sang of beginnings anyway. In a corner of the city that maps considered optional, a cradle swayed with the stubborn optimism of rope and human hands. In another corner, a silk canopy moved like a tide over a sleeping air. Perhaps a fact for scholars to bicker about over tea. In those years, a whisper carried farther than a decree, and a rumor could shelter a life as effectively as a wall could imprison it. A curiosity, if you like. Some women tie a red thread on the wrist of a child to confuse bad spirits. That night, 2 red threads flashed briefly in lamplight identical before one was cut in the name of order. And the debate that will sing through every corridor of this tale, is fate written by gods or by men with neat handwriting and somewhere to be by dawn? Listen closely. Do you hear it? The storm softens, the city exhales, and again there are 2 cries. One is recorded by drummers at a palace gate. One is swallowed by the river's long throat. Yet both tonight are real, and tomorrow one will be believed. Shall we follow them? There are cities that remember you even when you wish to disappear. Varanasi was one of them, ancient, unblinking, stitched together with incense smoke and human breath. Its alleys curved like veins, carrying life and waste through the same arteries. And somewhere among them, in a room small enough to fit both hunger and prayer, the child who should have been a prince learned the language of dust before he learned to speak. Arav grew as the monsoon grows, slowly, stubbornly against the weight of what surrounds it. His earliest memory was of sweeping, brooms taller than himself, the bristles whispering against temple stones slick with oil and devotion. He liked the echo of his own steps in the dawn, when the bells began their trembling songs and the priests had not yet noticed the hands that kept their altars clean. The city called people like him invisible, but Arav knew better. Invisibility has a sound, a rhythm, a smell. It is the hum of ashes under wet feet, the quiet pride of someone who survives by being unseen. His mother, Kavita, never told him the story of the night he arrived. Some truths grow best in silence. She only said the gods had given him when they were not looking, and that meant he must live gently so they would not take him back. His father, Ramesh, worked the ghats at dawn, sweeping the steps where the living prayed and the dead departed. He would come home carrying the scent of river smoke, always speaking softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred that wasn't his to name. In the evenings, when Arav sat by the doorway watching lanterns drift along the Ganges, his mother would hum a tune that wasn't quite a lullaby. It was circular, unresolved, the way memory sometimes is. "Remember, Arav," she'd say, "the river forgets nothing. Even when it looks calm, it remembers the storm that fed it." He didn't understand, but he liked how the words felt against his skin, half warning, half blessing. Meanwhile, in the high courtyards above the river, Another boy practiced archery under the watchful eye of a tutor who believed discipline was a form of worship. Tiarush, the palace heir, stood straight, his arrows splitting the monsoon air, his silk tunic clinging to a body untouched by dust. The arrowheads gleamed like the promises of a kingdom that still believed in purity. Every shot was greeted with applause from servants trained to celebrate precision more than mercy. When he missed, the tutor whispered hymns of self-control. When he succeeded, the queen smiled, a smile carved from relief rather than pride. Two boys breathing the same air divided by a line thinner than mist. Arav's world, by contrast, was built of repetitions: wash, sweep, bow, vanish. Yet there was a curiosity in him that the slums could not sweep away. He watched the priests recite verses he could never touch, watched the river reflect the temples upside down, and thought perhaps the world was already inverted. Sometimes he followed processions from a distance, fascinated by colors he wasn't allowed to wear: saffron, vermilion, gold. He liked to imagine what it must feel like to belong to a color, to wear something that announced you instead of hiding you. When he was 8, Arav was caught watching a wedding procession near the northern Ghat. The groom's horse was draped in red silk, its hooves striking sparks against the stone. A guard saw him and shouted, "Dalit, step away!" The word struck harder than any hand could. It wasn't new, but that day it landed differently. Heavy, final. The bride turned her face away, as if his presence might dissolve her jewelry. That night, Arav asked his mother what the word truly meant. Kavita looked at the fire, not at him. "It means the world believes you were born from what it throws away," she said softly. "But remember, even discarded seeds grow when the rain is stubborn." He began to notice how people flinched when he passed too close, how his friends' mothers pulled them inside when his shadow touched theirs. Yet there was one place where no one cared: the Ganges at sunrise. There everyone was bare, of silk, of titles, of shame. Arav learned to swim in those waters, his laughter rising like a hymn the priests could not silence. He often dove deep and opened his eyes beneath the surface, pretending the world above was just a dream. Once he thought he saw a reflection that wasn't his own, a face like his, watching from the ripples. He blinked, and it was gone. In the palace, the astrologer told the queen that her son's dreams were haunted by mirrors. Arash often woke gasping, claiming he had seen himself sweeping temple floors or drowning beneath the same river that glittered outside his window. The queen, terrified of omens, called for additional rituals. Priests walked in circles chanting to confuse destiny. The palace smelled of sandalwood and denial. Years passed. Arav's hands became calloused, his shoulders broad. The slum children respected him for his kindness. The priests tolerated him for his silence. Sometimes, when he carried water to the temple, he paused beneath the mural of a god holding 2 lotus flowers, one open, one closed. He felt something stir in his chest, like recognition misfiled by the gods. Then came the day the city prepared for the Festival of Lights. Even the poorest homes gathered clay lamps, filling them with mustard oil and wishes. Arav saved coins for weeks to buy a single wick. That evening, as he knelt by the riverbank, a procession of royal boats passed, each carrying musicians, dancers, and nobles dressed like myths come alive. Torches painted the water gold. At the center of it, beneath a canopy of crimson silk, stood Prince Arush, now a young man with the confidence of someone who has never been denied light. Arav lifted his lamp to the water, its reflection trembling beside the prince's torches. 2 flames, side by side, one grand, one fragile. The current carried them apart before either noticed. The next morning, the city awoke to find strange rumors spreading among the servants. The queen's mirror had cracked during her bath. The astrologer claimed it was a sign of duality returning. The same hour, at the lowest Ghat, Arav found a gold bracelet tangled in a fishing net, its design too intricate for any common hand. Inside, carved faintly in Sanskrit, were the letters AA, a name perhaps, or an echo. He hid it under his shirt and felt its weight against his heart. For reasons he couldn't explain, the metal felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for him. He showed it to his mother that evening. She froze. The color drained from her face, leaving behind the ghost of the secret she'd buried. She touched the bracelet as if it might burn. "Where did you find this?" "By the river," he said. "It was caught in the net." Her silence stretched like the distance between two shores. Finally, she whispered, "Sometimes the river returns what people try to drown." Outside, thunder growled, even though the skies were clear. Arav looked out the doorway toward the palace lights that shimmered faintly across the city. Somewhere beyond those walls, another boy with his face was lighting lamps of gold. He felt the bracelet pulse once, faintly, like a heartbeat out of rhythm with his own. And in that small pulse, the first thread of destiny began to tighten. Morning rose over Varanasi like a tired monarch, slow, reluctant, and already burdened by decisions made in the dark. The Ganges shimmered beneath the new sun, its surface folding light into secrets. Along its banks, chants and bells mingled with the clatter of wooden boats. And somewhere in that tapestry of sound, destiny began to hum its low, patient note. It was the season of devotion, when kings disguised themselves as pilgrims to cleanse sins they did not intend to stop committing. The royal court had announced a grand ritual at the temple of Vishwanath, a ceremony to mark the prince's 21st year, the age of inheritance, of oaths, of beginnings disguised as endings. The city responded the only way it knew how, with noise and reverence. Banners unfurled like tongues of flame, jasmine hung in garlands thick enough to drown the scent of poverty. Prince Arush rode at the center of the procession, seated on a white horse whose hooves clicked like polite applause. His robes shimmered in gold thread, his hands gloved in silk so fine it seemed afraid of him. Crowds lined the road, heads bowed, not entirely in respect, but in habit. The prince was not cruel, merely confident in a world that had always been arranged for his convenience. He believed kindness was inherited, like property. Among the throng of workers hired to prepare the temple, Arav carried a brass pitcher of water for purification rites. The sun burned on his back, and the dust rose around his feet like a second skin. When he looked up to see the procession, his breath caught in his throat. There, framed by banners and divine music, rode a man who wore his face. The sight was not merely resemblance, it was reflection. The same dark eyes, the same tilt of the mouth, even the faint scar above the brow where Arav had once fallen as a child. He blinked and the world seemed to tilt. The water pitcher trembled in his hands. Arush noticed him too, though he could not name what he saw. For a brief instant, their gazes locked across the dust and the incense smoke, and the air thickened into silence. The prince's horse halted mid-step, restless, as if sensing an unseen twin. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "A sign," someone whispered. "A curse," said another. The priests hurried forward, chanting to dissolve the moment, as though words could undo a reflection. The horse resumed its pace. The prince rode on. But his heart carried a new weight, a tiny fracture in certainty, the uncomfortable suspicion that his life might not belong entirely to him. Inside the temple courtyard, the ritual unfolded with opulent precision. Drums rolled, conch shells blared. The prince stood before the sacred flame, his forehead marked with vermilion. Yet the memory of that face, his face, lingered like smoke. He found himself turning toward the outer gates, expecting the reflection to return. Meanwhile, Arav remained outside, forced to kneel at the edge of the crowd. His duties were done, but curiosity is a stubborn god. Through the columns, he watched the prince lift the same kind of brass pitcher he himself had carried. The gesture mirrored his own down to the angle of the wrist. For a moment, the two movements aligned perfectly, like choreography rehearsed before birth. When the ceremony ended, the prince approached the outer courtyard, followed by attendants. Arav, still staring, forgot to lower his gaze. Their eyes met again, this time closer. The world fell quiet around them, as if even the air waited for recognition. A guard noticed the insolence. "Dalit!" he barked, striking Arav across the shoulder. "Look down!" Arush flinched at the sound of the word, though he did not know why. The syllables clung to him like something remembered from another life. He looked at Arav again, at the bruise blooming on skin identical to his own. "Enough," the prince said quietly. His voice, trained to command, carried even through humility. The guard froze mid-motion. "Let him be." Arav's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the strange tenderness in the command. He raised his head, and for a single breath both men stood eye to eye, one wearing silk, the other sweat, both equally bewildered by the symmetry of fate. The priest intervened, bowing low. "Your Highness, it is impure for you to stand so close to one of them. Please, for the sanctity of the ritual." Arash stepped back, uncertain, as if waking from a dream. "Of course," he said, though his words felt borrowed. Arav watched him leave, each step measured, rehearsed. When the prince disappeared through the archway, something inside him broke and reformed all at once. He turned toward the temple wall, pressed his palm against the cool stone, and whispered, "Why me?" That night, neither twin slept. In the palace, Arash dismissed his attendants and paced the marble corridor, lined with portraits of ancestors who all looked vaguely the same. Each painting seemed to accuse him of not knowing who he truly was. When he closed his eyes, he saw the Dalit boy's face superimposed on his own reflection in the mirror. It was not guilt he felt, nor pity. It was recognition, raw and uninvited. He summoned the palace astrologer. "Have I a twin?" he asked abruptly. The old man hesitated. "Your birth, Highness, is well recorded." "Recorded," Arash repeated, "not remembered." The astrologer bowed, retreating behind ritual phrases. But later that night he whispered to the chief priest that the prince's stars had begun to wobble. "Two souls were born under one sign," he murmured. "The heavens remember what men try to forget." Across the river, Arav lay awake on his mat, staring at the bracelet glinting faintly by lamplight. His mother's face was drawn, her eyes distant. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded. "He looked like me." "No," she said softly. "You look like him." The words struck deeper than any truth before. "Who is he?" She turned away. "Someone the world made sacred, so you could stay alive." A silence grew between them, heavy and alive. Then she said, "Do not go near the palace again. Some mirrors are forbidden. But curiosity is a rebellion written into the bones of every orphan of circumstance." Arav could not obey. He returned to the Ghats each day, watching the palace rise across the water like an accusation. And sometimes, when the sun fell just right, he thought he saw a figure standing on the opposite balcony, watching him too. Two silhouettes mirrored across the river, one gilded by dusk, one shadowed by smoke. It is said that when two identical souls look upon each other for too long, the gods begin to whisper. And that night, as both twins dreamed of a storm returning, the same whisper echoed in both their chests. "You are not supposed to be apart." There are secrets that live longer than the people who made them. They grow old in silence, feeding on guilt and ritual, until one day they find their voice in the most unexpected mouths. Kamala, the midwife who had carried the forbidden infant into the storm 21 years ago, now moved through the narrow lanes of Varanasi like a ghost who had misplaced her grave. Her spine had bent under years of unspoken prayers. Her hair was the color of monsoon mist, yet her eyes, sharp, unrepentant, still carried the memory of that night. She had not returned to the palace since, but she had followed its stories the way one follows the scent of a wound. That morning, as she sat outside her hut grinding turmeric, a boy ran past yelling about a miracle. "A Dalit with the face of a prince?" The words fell into her ears like a coin dropped into a well that already knew its depth. Kamala's hand froze mid-motion. Her pulse trembled in her wrists. The gods, she thought, were finally asking her to pay what she owed. She left her house before the pestle hit the ground. The lanes were alive with rumor, markets buzzing, priests whispering, servants trading stories over rice and fear. Somewhere in those whispers, she caught the name Arav, a boy who worked at the temple, a boy who had touched holiness with bare feet, a boy who had looked into the face of the prince and made the sun hesitate. Kamala walked until the city thinned into silence. At the edge of the river she found him, barefoot, shirt open at the throat, washing copper vessels. The afternoon light cut his face in two, half gold, half shadow. It was like seeing the past carved anew. Her knees weakened. The gods had not only remembered, they had repeated themselves. "Child," she said, her voice breaking through years of dust. He turned, polite, cautious. "Yes, Ma." "Do you know who you are?" Arav smiled faintly. "A servant of the temple." "No," she said. "You are a question the palace forgot to answer." He frowned, thinking she was mad, but something in her eyes, an old, guilty clarity, kept him still. She stepped closer, trembling. "I was there when you were born. I heard 2 cries that night." He stopped breathing. The bracelet at his wrist glinted as if listening. Kamala reached inside her sari, drew out a small cloth bundle she had carried for years, a scrap of silk embroidered with royal sigils faded by time. She unfolded it slowly, reverently, like scripture. "You wore this when I carried you away. The palace paid for silence, not for forgetting." Arav stared at the silk. The smell of it, camphor, jasmine, something distant, rose like memory from another life. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she whispered, "that you were born in gold and raised in ashes." He shook his head. "No, my mother is Kavita. My father is Ramesh." "They loved you," Kamala said gently. "But you were not theirs. You were given to them because another child had died the same night you lived. The dead took your name. The living took your place." The river swelled behind them, as if the Ganges itself wanted to interrupt. Arav stepped back, eyes wide. "Then who am I?" Kamala's tears came quietly, like rain on stone. "You are the blood that was denied its name. The second son of the house of Varanasi. The twin who was traded for peace." He stared past her, toward the horizon where the palace shimmered like a mirage. In his chest, something ancient stirred, anger, wonder, and a loneliness that had been waiting for a name. "Does the queen know?" "She knew," Kamala said. "Perhaps she remembers in her dreams when guilt wears her perfume." The wind picked up, flinging dust into their faces. Kamala caught his wrist and pressed the cloth bundle into his hands. "If you go to them, go as a storm, not a beggar. The palace only listens when thunder speaks." That night, Arav returned home late. His mother waited, her face illuminated by a single oil lamp. She saw the silk in his hands and closed her eyes. "I hoped she had died before she could find you," she whispered. "It's true then." Her silence was confirmation enough. He sat beside her, the floor cold beneath them. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because truth doesn't feed the hungry," she said, her voice a brittle prayer. "And I was afraid that if you knew where you came from, you'd stop belonging to where you are." He wanted to argue, but the love in her exhaustion disarmed him. He placed the silk on the floor between them, as if dividing 2 worlds. "You gave me life," he said softly. "That makes you my mother more than anyone." She smiled brokenly. "Then promise me you won't chase ghosts." But the promise dissolved before it could reach his lips. Across the river in the palace, Prince Arush stared into the mirror for the 100th time, searching for the shadow he'd seen that day. His reflection felt foreign now, like a borrowed face. Servants whispered that the prince had become quiet, distracted. He had begun to ask questions about the night of his birth, questions that made courtiers nervous. When his tutor presented him with the royal genealogy, a scroll of names written in perfect Sanskrit, Arush noticed a blank space, a smudge where a line had been erased. "What name was here?" he asked. The tutor stammered. "An error in the ink, Your Highness." "Then the gods must have a sense of irony," he murmured. That evening, as the palace prepared for another festival, Arush felt drawn to the river without knowing why. He walked to the balcony overlooking the ghats. The air was thick with the smell of ghee lamps and marigold smoke. Below, among the flickering lights, he saw movement, a young man standing at the edge of the water, holding something that gleamed faintly in the dark. For a heartbeat, Arush thought he was looking at his own reflection in the river. Then the reflection lifted its head and met his gaze. 2 faces, one above the water, one below, bound by the same thread of light. Somewhere between them, The wind carried the faintest echo of an old woman's voice. Two cries, one truth, the gods are not finished with you yet. There are moments when truth does not arrive as revelation, but as contagion. Quiet at first, then unstoppable. By dawn, the secret had infected the palace. A servant had seen the prince staring down at the river. A priest had noticed the resemblance. A guard had whispered that the gods had duplicated the royal face. By mid-morning, the rumor had swollen into scripture. A curse upon the bloodline, they said, a test from the heavens. In a country ruled as much by symbols as by swords, resemblance itself could be blasphemy. When the queen heard, she fainted without ceremony. When she woke, her first word was not the name of her son, but atonement. The High Council gathered in the Hall of Mirrors, a cruel choice of room considering what they feared. Reflections multiplied endlessly, each one threatening to become truth. The chief priest stood beneath the painted ceiling, his voice oily with authority. Two faces cannot claim one lineage, he declared. The gods made the castes for order. When order collapses, impurity walks in daylight. The steward, ever loyal to the arithmetic of power, suggested a ritual, ancient, dramatic, effective. If the boy is of pure birth, he said, the holy fire will recognize him. If he is not, the flames will reject him. Arush listened in silence, his jaw locked. He had not spoken since the rumors began. He had tried to send messengers to find the boy at the ghats, but they never returned. Some truths, it seemed, were too heavy to carry uphill. By the third day, the decree was written. A purity ritual would be held at the river temple at sunrise. One of the two, prince or impostor, would walk through sacred fire. The gods would decide which body the lineage would keep. Across the city, Arav learned of the ritual through the same murmuring tide of gossip. The temple priests, usually deaf to anything below their rank, now spoke his name with open disgust and a touch of fear. The untouchable who looks like royalty, they said, as though resemblance were theft. Kavita begged him not to go. They will not test your purity, she warned. They will burn your existence. I need to know, he said, even if the fire answers with silence. Kamala found him that night. Her body was failing, her breath short as candle smoke. She pressed a small amulet into his hand, a copper charm shaped like the moon. If the gods demand a body, let them take mine instead, she whispered. Arav smiled sadly. You already gave me life once. Don't give me death too. The next morning, the city gathered along the Ganges as if for a coronation. The air was heavy with incense, but underneath the sweetness lurked the sour smell of fear. Drummers beat slow rhythms, priests carried bowls of ghee, chanting verses older than mercy. At the river's edge, two platforms faced each other, one draped in silk, one in coarse cloth. Arush stood on the golden one, bare-chested, the royal sigil painted on his skin. Across from him, Arav stood barefoot on the rough wood, his skin glistening with river water, his eyes calm as dusk. They looked at each other, mirror to mirror, brother to brother, truth to consequence. The crowd murmured, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or sacrilege. The chief priest raised his arms. By Agni, the sacred flame, we ask the gods to separate light from shadow, truth from imitation. A fire was lit between them, the smoke curling upward like the spine of a serpent. Step forward, the priest commanded. Arush hesitated. He is my brother, he said, his voice cracking through the ritual silence. Blasphemy, hissed the priest. You defile your own name. Arav took a step toward the fire. If purity is proven by pain, let me walk first. But Arush moved faster, stepping between him and the flames. No, he said. You've suffered enough. The crowd gasped. Some shouted that compassion itself was corruption. Others fell silent, unsure which face the gods would strike first. Arush turned to the priest. If the fire is divine, it will know me. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped into the flames. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. The fire bent around him, not devouring, not sparing, merely watching. His eyes met Arav's across the wavering heat, and both men understood something wordless. Purity is a lie men invented to protect their privilege. Then the wind rose, the fire flared violently, and Arush vanished into the blaze. The priests screamed of omens. The queen fainted again. The crowd surged forward only to be held back by guards. Arav leapt into the fire after him. The smoke swallowed them both. When the flames died, the platform was empty. The river hissed as sparks fell into its dark mouth. The priests declared it divine judgment. One twin purified, the other consumed. The steward ordered the ashes to be scattered immediately, so no relics could contradict scripture. By sunset, the city's chatter had turned to myth. The gods claimed both, they said, one as sacrifice, one as savior. But among the ashes, the amulet Kamala had given glimmered faintly, unburned. A breeze carried it into the river, where it sank with a quiet dignity, as if following the brothers downstream. That night, Kamala died in her sleep. Kavita wept without understanding why the wind smelled like sandalwood and rain. And in the palace, the queen awoke from a dream of two cries echoing through fire, one of pain, one of release. She rose from bed trembling and walked to the balcony. The Ganges shimmered below, calm, endless. For a moment, she thought she saw two shapes moving beneath the surface, drifting side by side like mirrored stars. She closed her eyes. "Forgive us," she whispered. But the river, eternal witness to men's inventions of purity, said nothing. Dawn came slowly that day, as if the sun itself feared to touch the city. The air was thick with incense and aftermath. Along the riverbank, ashes still floated like pale petals, remnants of a fire that had consumed not just two bodies, but a belief. The Ganges carried everything away as it always did, secrets, sins, and stories too dangerous to keep. For the first time in years, the palace was silent. No bells, no chanting, no orders barked down marble corridors. Only the low hum of mourning, quiet as dust, settling after a storm. The priests called it divine judgment. The people called it justice. The queen called it punishment. But the river called it something else, return, because even as the city prepared offerings to honor the lost prince, whispers began to move upstream. Fishermen claimed that at dawn they had seen two figures carried by the current, entangled yet alive, clinging to each other like memory refusing to die. The guards dismissed it as superstition, but the story grew legs and then wings, and by nightfall it had already become a prayer. Downstream, far from the palace, two bodies lay half buried in reeds. Their skin, wet with ash and river light, shimmered faintly, as if the Ganges had spared them out of pity or disobedience. Arav woke first. His throat burned with smoke, his breath raw. For a moment, he thought he had died. Then he heard the river breathing beside him, patient and alive. Next to him, Arush stirred, coughing water, his hair plastered to his face. He looked at Arav and saw himself reflected in the other's exhaustion. The silence between them was enormous, an entire civilization's worth of unspoken things. "You're alive," Arav whispered. Arush laughed weakly. Then the gods must be confused. They sat there for a long time, neither speaking nor moving. The fire's heat still lived in their skin, but so did the river's cool mercy. Finally, Arush said, "They will hunt us. The palace cannot allow two truths." "Then we leave," Arav replied. "Let the river write our story instead." They walked until the city disappeared behind them. The land grew wild, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and cow dung and new beginnings. They found shelter in a half-ruined temple, its walls covered in faded murals of gods whose faces had eroded into something human. At night, they lit small fires from driftwood, their flames modest but alive. Arush stared into the flicker. "All my life, I believed purity was protection," he said. "That the world was made of layers, some born to rule, some born to serve. But the fire showed me a nothing burns clean." Arav smiled faintly. "I used to think the same about the river, that it washed away sin, but it doesn't. It only carries it somewhere else." They sat in silence, listening to the frogs and the soft rustle of monsoon leaves. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells rang for evening prayer, their sound thin and uncertain. Days passed. News of the ritual's outcome reached the villages in fragments. The prince had died. The Dalit impostor had been cursed. The queen had gone into mourning. None of it was entirely true, but in India, truth often travels disguised as myth. Arav began tending to the sick in nearby settlements, cleaning wounds, fetching water, teaching children to read by scratching letters in the dust. People called him a saint, though he laughed at the word. Arish stayed hidden, watching from the shadows as his brother moved among the people, with a gentleness that made him ashamed of every privilege he had ever worn. One night Arish said, "You should take my name. Let them believe the prince survived." Arav shook his head. "Names are cages. You keep yours. I'll keep the silence." The monsoon deepened. The temple roof leaked. Fever found them both. Kamala's amulet, which Arav still wore, turned cold against his skin. Arush, delirious, whispered of the palace, of his mother's face, of the cracked mirror, of the fire. "I thought being pure meant being chosen," he murmured. "But the gods, they never chose. Men did." When morning came, Arush's breathing had slowed to a thread. Arav held his hand and wept quietly, not as a brother but as a mirror mourning its reflection. As the sun rose, the prince exhaled once, softly, as if returning a borrowed breath. Arav carried his body to the riverbank. The Ganges shimmered gold, forgiving as always. He built a pyre of driftwood, whispering no prayers, only truths. "He was not born untouchable," Arav said aloud, though no one was there to hear. "None of us are." The flames rose gently, not in hunger, but in acceptance. When they died down, Arav took a handful of ashes and released them into the current. The river accepted without question, without ceremony. Then he stepped into the water. It reached his knees, his chest, his throat. The current pulled, not cruelly, but with purpose. For a moment his body hesitated, half in, half out of the world. Then he let go. The water closed above him with the calm of inevitability. By dusk, fishermen downstream saw a single figure standing on a sandbar, robes clinging like second skin, head bowed, hands clasped in prayer. Some swore it was the prince. Others said it was the Dalit who had defied fire. Either way, the legend had already begun. In the palace, the queen dreamed again of two cries, this time blending into one, seamless and whole. She woke with tears on her face and a strange peace in her chest. The storm outside had ended, and on the river, where the fire's ashes had vanished, the Ganges shone like a sheet of glass, holding two shadows beneath its surface, forever swimming, forever one. Years passed, and the river forgot how to tell time. Seasons changed like quiet moods, monsoon to drought, festival to mourning, birth to cremation, and still the Ganges carried its infinite cargo of faith and denial. The city healed, or pretended to. The palace stood as it always had, gilded and hollow, its corridors echoing with footsteps of people afraid to speak too loudly around history. But far beyond the city's edge, in the shadow of a ruined temple swallowed by vines, a man walked among the poor, barefoot, unadorned, with a serenity that frightened the priests. He wore a simple cotton robe, carried no emblem, and answered to no name. Children followed him with the same instinct that draws moths to a lamp. He never said who he was. Some believed he was a wandering monk, touched by enlightenment. Others whispered that he was the ghost of the prince, doomed to walk the earth until his mother's tears dried. A few said he was the Dalit reborn, proof that even the lowest soul could become divine. But the truth, if truth can survive so many retellings, was simpler. He was both and neither. The man spoke softly, in words that sounded less like sermons and more like memories. Purity, he told the crowds that gathered around him, is not born in blood. It is born in kindness. He touched lepers without fear, washed the feet of beggars, blessed the dead without asking their caste. When people called him Maharaj, he smiled gently and said, "No, I am only water learning to flow." They began to call him the Forgotten Twin. Stories spread faster than the river's current. Villagers swore he could heal fevers with a single touch, that the water turned clear where he bathed. Others claimed he spoke to the river as if it were an old friend, thanking it for returning what fire had taken. Every tale, whether true or embroidered, carried the same pulse: redemption. One evening, as the sun bled over the horizon, he returned to the ghats of Varanasi. the place where everything had begun. The palace glimmered across the water, distant and unchanging. He stood there a long while, watching the lamps drift down the river in celebration of another god's festival. Their reflections trembled like uncertain souls seeking home. A little boy approached, holding a small clay lamp. "Baba," he asked, "why do we send light into the river?" The man smiled. "So the river remembers us." "Does it?" He looked down at the child, the same dark eyes, the same question that had once lived inside him. "Always," he said, "even when we forget ourselves." The boy placed his lamp on the water, and the man did the same. Two lights side by side began their slow journey downstream. The current pulled them apart, then brought them close again, like a breath deciding whether to end or begin. Behind them, temple bells rang for evening prayer. Across the water, the palace echoed the sound, two tones separated by distance but joined in rhythm. The man turned to leave. His figure dissolved into the crowd, another shadow among countless others, indistinguishable and eternal. Later that night, an old fisherman swore he saw two figures walking along the riverbank under the moonlight, their faces the same, their steps perfectly synchronized. He couldn't tell which one was alive, maybe both were, maybe neither. And somewhere, carried by the wind from palace to slum, came the echo of that first night, the sound of rain, the hush of silk, and two newborn cries weaving into one. "In the beginning there were two," the river seemed to whisper, "but the world could only bear one name, so it forgot. And yet I remember." The camera fades slowly to the shimmer of water. The sound of the river becomes the soft breathing of a sleeping child. The story closes where it began. Two cries, one destiny, and a silence between them that will never fully die. If the river carried you through this story, if its echoes still linger somewhere in your chest, stay a while longer. Subscribe so that the next secret may find you. Leave your thoughts below. Every word is another lamp on the water, and remember, no story once heard is ever truly forgotten.